Today we're going to cover how to swap the elements of an array. Now what does this mean? Essentially what it means is we're going to take the order of the elements. If I had an array starting with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, if I was to swap the elements of the array or reverse it, I'm going to have an array that starts with 50, 40, 30, 20, and so on. So that's how we reverse the array. Essentially, we're going to switch values. Now, for this demonstration, we're not going to use Java collections like array lists or vectors or any other type of collection. We're going to just use a standard Java array. Now, let's take a look at the Excel. Let's take a look at the Excel example we have here. Here I have an array of 6 elements. Now, in order to reverse this array, essentially I want to swap the mirroring elements in the array. So what I would want to do is I would want to take the first and the last element and swap those values. So this would now become 60 and this would now become 10. Then I would want to take another step and go take 1 and 1 off the element. So I want to swap element 1 and element 4 for 50 and 20. And finally, I would swap the last middle elements of 2 and 3 to 40 and 30. So ultimately, I have an array that's been reversed. I'm just switching the elements. Now, how would I accomplish this? Now, we know, because we know that Java's indexes of an array starts at 0 and ends at the length of the array minus 1. So in this example, I have an array of length 6. The last element is going to be 5. If I had an array of 100, the last element is going to be 99. So in algebra, we can represent this with a variable n. So here, we know that the last index of an array is always length minus 1. So let's set n to length minus 1. Now that we've set that value, let's take a look at how n works in this array. So say I put n right here. Well, I know that 4, if I have 1, I want to know how I can get 4. Well, I know that 4 is really n minus 1, right? 5 minus 1 or equals 4. I know that 3 is n minus 2. So we're starting to see a pattern here. I want to swap. I can also say n equals n minus 0. So I'm going to put this right here so it makes sense. 5 minus 0 is 5. So you're starting to see a pattern here. So on my first array, if I was to set this to 0, I want to swap it with n minus 0. I want to swap element 1 with element n minus 1. I want to swap element 2 with element n minus 2. And that works for any size array. Now, this is an even array. We can do the same thing with odd arrays. We won't cover that in this video. But you notice the pattern. So another pattern you notice is that how many times do I want to do this swap? I don't want to do it for every element of the array, because if I was to continue to go up through the array, I'd start swapping it backwards and swapping it back to where it was. So if you noticed, I swapped it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and then I'm done. When I've gone through half of the array, I've swapped it with the mirror half. So to answer this question below, how many times do I want to swap? I want to swap it 3 times, which is 6 divided by 2. I want to swap it half the times. Now, using variables, we know that length is, we want to swap it length, 6 divided by 2, which is 3. So we want to store that as well. We'll store that in the times variable. So at this point, let's make that happen in code. So before I get into the reverse function, I want to cover this swap function. Now, we took for granted I'm going to swap elements in the array. So what I'm going to do to make it easier is I'm going to create a function called swap. And all it's going to do is, I don't really care where in the array I'm going to swap. I'm going to take any element in the array and swap it with another element. So here I am, I pass in 2 indexes, A and B, somewhere A and B. And I hold index A, the value for index A, off in a temporary variable, in temp. Then I set the value of A to B, and then I set B back to the value of A. So that's how this function works. Very simple. I hold A off, I override it with B, and I set B back to A, and that's how we do a swap. So that's the way this function works, and we'll need to take that for granted. So now let's take a look at the reverse function. So just like we said earlier, I want to find the last element of the array, and I'm going to assign that to n. And essentially it's the array's length minus 1. That's what we talked about. Also, how many times do I want to do this? We also talked about that. I want to do it half of the amount of times. So I'm going to take the length of the array and divide it by 2. Now I have my variables. If this sounds a lot like algebra, it's kind of is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with 0, and I'm going to repeat this half of the times, and I'm going to swap it with the mirror opposite, which is n minus I. So if I is 0, I'm going to swap with n minus 0. If I is 1, I'm going to swap it with n minus 1. If I is 2, n minus 2, and so on till we get to the middle. Let's take a look at how this works. I'm going to debug it through, and here off to the left-hand side, you'll be able to see as I trace through it. So I'm going to create an array of 10 values. At this point, you can see index 0 is 10, index 1 is 20, and so on to 100. And I'm going to print that out. You see I've printed that out to the screen, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, all the way through 100. Now I'm going to call the reverse function. We're going to step through that. So here's what we talked about. Int n is length minus 1, which is 9. And then the number of times, which is going to be 10 divided by 2, which is 5. So let's step through this. Here I'm going to step through the first element of the array. Here you can see over here, I'm going to swap element I with n minus I. So I'm going to swap element 0 with element 9. So let's take a look at this. So I have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, all the way through 100. Let's step through it and see what happens. You can see 9 and 0 swap places. Let's take it the next step. I is now 1. So I'm going to swap element 1 with element 8. We'll take a look at that, and sure enough, 90 is swapped with 20. To the next one, I is now 2, and n minus I is 7. We swap those values, and so on. I'm just going to keep going through, 70 with 40, and 50 with 60, and then we print it out. That concludes swapping an array. Thank you.